I would like to begin by introducing Dr. Sunera, who is our second speaker, keynote speaker for the afternoon. Dr. Thobani is Associate Professor in the Department of Asian Studies and the Institute for Gender, Race, and Sexuality and Social Justice at the University of British Columbia. Her scholarship focuses on critical race, post-colonial and feminist theory, globalization, media, citizenship, and migration, and violence, Muslim women, and the war on terror. She had asked us to keep her introduction short, so I'm going to take the liberty to say that I just think you're fabulous. I always have. We all do. There are lots of fans in the room. I've been reading your work since I was a grad student a long time ago. Was actually very inspired by your activism in NAC. So I've been following your career and admiring you for many years. I'm a fan. And so I'm so pleased when you agreed to participate in our conference, so thank you. Please join me in welcoming Dr.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction. Thank you for inviting me to be here. I'm very, very honored to, have been invited here, and I'm really thrilled to see a conference that focuses and highlights feminist activism. This is a crucial moment, and I think it's really important that activism continue to remain on the agenda of women's studies programs, gender studies programs, as they're changing and developing. I would like to begin by acknowledging that we are on Indigenous lands and that Indigenous peoples across Canada are engaged in struggles for sovereignty. And I make this statement as a statement of solidarity for Indigenous people's struggles, because I believe there can be no justice, no equity for women, for racial minorities, for anybody in this country, unless there is justice for Indigenous peoples. So I'd like to begin with that recognition. I would also like to thank all the volunteers who must have put this event together. Thank you very much for doing this hard work. So, even as I begin by saying that there is a really important need right now to highlight the question of feminist and women's activism, I think this moment also demands a re-questioning of that activism, a rethinking, a questioning of that activism, a rethinking of that activism. Because the questions that we face today with regard to feminism are what kind of feminism, what kind of activism, and most important, to what end? And it's from that spirit of questioning that I'm going to be making the comments that I am. I will be presenting a critical perspective on feminism because I think that is of vital necessity in this particular moment. And, it's something that's been with us for a long time, but somehow we just can't seem to get the answers straight to many of the questions that face feminists in all our diversity and difference. So the moment that we're living through, I think, is one of great turmoil, global upheaval that is changing the post-Second World War international order in very profound ways. Everywhere around us, we're seeing the rise of wars, occupation, invasions, new forms. In Canada, we're very familiar with settler colonialism and what that looks like. We understand very well the kinds of violence that are entailed in a settler colonial project. But at the moment, what we're living through is an exacerbation of the inequalities that have resulted from centuries of colonialism, from slavery, from capitalist modernity, and from the decades of neoliberal globalization these are now compounded by the undoing of the post-World War II liberal order everywhere around us, the dismantling of liberal institutions. The new wars, invasions, occupations, I put my glasses on, are reasserting colonial modes of governance in global institutions, in international institutions. Islamophobia is being institutionalized as the dominant ideology in global politics. Refugees and migrants displaced by the catastrophic violence and environmental destruction in their societies are caught up in unprecedented flows of migration. We're living with the rise of racist, anti-Black, and ultranationalist movements across North America and Europe. In this volatile climate, finding lasting and sustainable solutions for these crises of the day, undoing old and new forms of violence, dehumanization, and disenfranchisement, these are the most urgent tasks that we face. So in my presentation, what I want to do is examine feminist responses to these conditions, which have been escalated by the global war on terror. And I've been tracking feminist responses since the 9/11 attacks in the US, and since the launch of the global war on terror. And you know, it's really depressing that 15 years on, we seem to be caught in the same conundrums in terms of feminist thinking and feminist activism on the issue of the global war on terror. So what I will do in my talk is I want to highlight the different political positions that have been taken by feminists, those who oppose the war as well as those who have supported parts of the war on terror, the invasion of Afghanistan, the occupation of Afghanistan, being where we've seen the most kind of consolidated articulation of feminist support for that particular invasion and occupation. Now that, of course, inaugurated the larger global war on terror, which continues to grow. 15 years on hand, we've seen it expand. So I was very interested in looking at the feminists who opposed the initial launch of the war on terror and the ones who supported it. And I was interested not just in feminist activists, not just in women's organizations and the many statements that they put out, the many demonstrations, well, not that many, but the few demonstrations that they did organize. And also, I became very interested in the texts that feminist theorists, feminist intellectuals, who kind of straddle the divide between the university and community activism, what were the perspectives that they were putting out? What was their thinking about what was the cause of the global war on terror, how could the conflict be resolved, what the relationship of gender was to this conflict, what was the role of women, what was the role of feminist activism. So these are the kinds of questions that I was very interested in thinking through. That also was tied to a larger project of thinking about what were the new forms of femininities and masculinities that were being deployed by the war on terror. Because, you know, part of what my larger work is to think through what kinds of masculinities became hegemonic, what kinds of masculinities were pushed into the background, what kinds of femininities and feminisms became dominant in that moment, and what were the other kinds of feminist politics that they pushed off the agenda. So, you know, it was a very complicated kind of project for me, and I continue to work on it. So the feminist texts and public statements that I have looked at so far, I find reveals that there are significant similarities in feminist conceptualizations of global politics and in their political assumptions about the nature and causes of the global war on terror and its relation to gender whether these feminists opposed or supported the war on terror, the war in Afghanistan. Now with Iraq, of course, we saw a splintering of the consensus that had emerged, and the idea that the Afghan war was the good war, the Iraq war was the bad war, and that kind of thinking continues to stay with us, distinguishing between the good parts of the global war on terror from what are seen to have been terrible mistakes. I'm, of course, conceptualizing the global war on terror as, you know, a kind of one phenomenon, and I think it's a mistake to make a separation between the good parts of the war and violence and the bad parts of it. So my critique is based on thinking about the global war on terror as a whole and what it portends for women around the world. So my analysis of the feminist texts, campaigns, and public statements finds that their assumptions and the analytic perspectives they give rise to have buttressed rather than eroded the dominant narratives of the West, of Islam as the enemy of the West, and of the truth about Muslims as being more patriarchal, more misogynist, more homophobic. That has been very much part of the ideological framing by successive US administrations of the global war on terror. And what I find is that these feminist statements and documents actually fit in very nicely with the basic assumptions, with the founding assumptions of this dominant ideology that now many of us call Islamophobia. Further, as these feminists define woman as endangered by the violence and terror of the threat posed by Islam and the figure of the Muslim, particularly the Muslim male, they have revitalized Western feminism through a politics of the global that constitutes the West's gendered subject as the mark of the universal woman, and constructed Muslim woman as the abject object, you know, what Gayatri Spivak has called the toxic effects of imperialism, and the world of Islam itself as a world of death, violence, and misogyny. So this is my overall reading of where feminism is headed at this particular moment. Indeed, when we compare these assumptions and those of the neoconservatives and now the ultra-nationalist populist politics that are on the rise in North America and Europe, we sometimes find a confluence that is really very, very disturbing. To be clear, I am not arguing that feminist texts, statements, politics that I'm studying share the same political vision or the same political objectives as those of the neoconservative state elites and the populist politicians and right-wing nationalists. What I am arguing is that there is an urgent need to rethink feminist politics and to rethink it on the basis of centering anti-Islamophobia, anti-racism, and anti-colonialism. Now, many of us have been fighting for just such a feminist politics for many, many decades. In Canada, the 1990s was a period when we saw anti-racist feminism actually having some impact on mainstream feminism. We have seen Indigenous women's activism in Canada actually put anti-colonial politics on the kind of national agenda. My argument is that the global war on terror has been a tremendous setback for those kinds of politics, and we have seen the revitalization of white supremacist politics generally, but a reassertion of Western feminism within the larger feminist movements that we have tried to build in this country and internationally. So what I'm going to say, as I said earlier, is my comments are made in the spirit of this rethinking of feminist politics. So towards the end of the 20th century, Western feminists in North America, activists and academics alike, were publicly deliberating whether feminism's transformational potential has been exhausted. Movement politics were floundering in the face of the twin assaults of neoliberal restructuring and the angry white male backlash that accompanied it. While the former was eroding the socio-economic gains women had made since the 1960s, and in Canada we are living through a period of the dismantling of the welfare state that began in the 1980s and gained much speed in the 1990s. So we've seen this erosion of the socio-economic gains women had made since the 1960s by the decimation of social programs and the fundamental reshaping of the workforce. And with that, we also saw the rise of this angry white male backlash, and Susan Faludi wrote about that very powerfully in the 1990s. This, articulated in the politics of the newly emergent and highly vocal men's rights movement, had set its target on women's access to abortion, to child custody rights, as well as on the anti-violence feminist movement in Canada. A number of prominent women, including some who had previously identified as feminists, often fed, if not outright led, these anti-feminist politics of the period. Many of these women claimed that feminists had turned women into perpetual victims, that feminism denied them any recognizable agency. They also accused feminazis of imposing a stifling political correctness on public discourse that they considered to be not very productive to advancing the cause of women's rights. Disagreements, even struggles amongst the different political and theoretical traditions internal to feminism were also taking their toll. Some feminists pronounced the death of feminist politics in the face of the challenges posed by indigenous women, women of color, women with disabilities, and queer women to the white middle-class heterosexual woman who had long reigned as the real subject of feminism. Other feminists worried that feminism's radical potential had been diluted through its institutionalization and professionalization within the academy, as women's studies programs became increasingly disengaged from movement politics, and with the bureaucratization of feminism within the state, as feminism became incorporated into the machinery of women's ministries, secretaries, and gender mainstream policies, we saw the emergence of the term state feminism. So these were all internal debates that were, taking place as I explained, due to internal factors as well as external factors within the larger kind of framework of feminist politics. And I'm defining feminist politics very broadly here. I'm including the politics of women of color who identified as politics, as feminists. This is the milieu in which these debates are taking place. Yet other feminists fretted that perhaps feminists had become too comfortable with the status quo, and having lost touch with disenfranchised women, were increasingly becoming theory-obsessed, elitist, or simply politically disillusioned. We live with some of those accusations even now, particularly those of us who work in women's studies programs. There's a kind of blanket, assessment of us having, been co-opted, being, lost the activist roots, lost our grounding in the women's movements. Now, these were all, from my perspective, very important, very necessary, and very productive debates. There was a robust exchange and dialogue about these issues, not as much as many of us would have liked, but at least the feminist agenda, broadly speaking, was defined by these kinds of debates. Then came the attacks of 9/11 and the global war on terror. Suddenly, presidents and prime ministers declared themselves willing to go to war to fight terrorism and secure Muslim women's rights. Feminism became all the rage as the status of Muslim women became a key concern of international politics. As the invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq unfolded, women were suddenly visible in highly prestigious positions at the White House, in Congress, Congress, in parliaments, at the State Department, in the Pentagon, in parliaments around the Western world. Women's rights activists appeared on primetime news and talk shows, on radio and television. They were featured prominently in films and documentaries, at festivals and international human rights gatherings. Almost overnight, feminism acquired a new lease on life, as enthusiastic women and men clamored to discuss the abject status of the oppressed Muslim woman, whether in Afghanistan, Iraq, or in their nearest immigrant ghetto. Well, it was a particular kind of feminism that became exercised with this burning desire. This concern remained central in the Bush administration. The Bush administration, of course, identified a saving woman of color, as they called Muslim women, from Muslim men. This concern remained central also in the Obama administration. Hillary Clinton declared that the status of women was, quote, a national security concern for the Obama administration. In Europe, feminist politicians championed what they called a feminist foreign policy for their states and for the states in the global south. The global war on terror has been waged with a historically unprecedented level of participation by women in its various front lines. Particularly in the West, women have made great inroads in journalism, politics, the military, international development, the NGO sector, publishing, filmmaking, the beauty industry, and in virtually every other field of industry and opportunity that has been touched by the global war on terror. But how have feminists responded to this post-9/11 state of affairs? How have they theorized the war, and most importantly, the relation of gender to terror and to violence? Given the centrality of the idea of the clash of civilizations in the early framing of the war, how have feminists defined the relation of feminism and negotiated their own relationship to the dominant construct of the West as civilizationally and culturally superior, and its Islamic other as barbaric, fanatic, and medieval in its essential leanings? Feminist and women's organizations have, of course, been divided in their responses to the war. While some supported all aspects of the war on terror, others opposed some aspects of it. Some opposed all aspects of the war on terror. But while many opposed the Iraq war, defining it as unnecessary and a war of choice, they continued also to see the expansion of the war into Libya and Syria as mistakes. These divided political responses, unfortunately, did not see a division in the basic framing of the relationship of gender to the global war on terror. So in my study, I looked at the responses of a number of leading North American feminists across a broad range of theoretical feminist traditions, from liberal to socialist to post-structural to postmodern feminism. Remember the days when this is what we used to teach in women's studies programs? Well, these politics continue to have a deep effect in the organizing of women's organizations. On the ground, they have a huge impact in how feminist politics are articulated and understood, the kinds of coalitions that are sought out and actually worked on. So I will, make no apology for continuing to think about the different theoretical traditions that actually define feminist politics in this moment. I found that overall, despite their varied, even oppositional political responses to the war and the imperialist state, there are a number of surprising convergences in the foundational assumptions. Since these responses map out the parameters for the possibilities or impossibilities of anti-racist and anti-imperialist solidarity among women in their differing locations, my work has focused primarily on identifying the discursive practices, the political strategies, the forms of subjectivity, including feminist subjectivity, that I have found to largely sustain the idea of the dominance of Western culture and Western civilization. a valorizing of whiteness in the war on terror, albeit in its feminist forms. Now, of course, these are long-standing, these draw on long-standing colonial ideologies. What has changed since 9/11 and the global war on terror is that they have a newfound respectability. That this kind of discourse has become normalized, it is becoming institutionalized. We are seeing racial profiling, practices like racial profiling, particularly in targeting quote-unquote terrorist suspects, having become legitimized. Of course, racial profiling has always been directed to particular communities. Indigenous and Black peoples in Canada have received the brunt of this kind of racial profiling, but now we're seeing that racial profiling has come to be seen to make sense. We have seen the use of violence in global governance as now being considered ethically and politically necessary in the governance of Muslims around the world. So this is the major shift that has happened, and I think this major shift needs to be put front and center when we're talking about feminist activism. So while many feminists publicly supported the war on terror, they drew attention to what they defined as Islam's misogyny and Muslim men's hatred of women. Here my argument is that Islamophobia certainly emerged as a dominant ideology from this idea of the clash of civilizations. Feminists were situated where they could have countered the gendered aspects of the Islamophobic discourse. And by this, I mean the construction of Muslim women as abject objects, the construction of Islam as the most patriarchal, the construction of Muslim men as the most misogynist, as the most homophobic, that feminists were placed in a very good location to counter those Islamophobic politics, and instead what we saw was feminists gendering Islamophobic politics, giving it a legitimacy, which was for many of us in the anti-racist, anti-imperialist movement a very shocking development. And from my experience, that actually shunted the anti-racist politics that were making an impact on mainstream feminist politics from the center of the feminist movement. So I'll give you some examples of how this Islamophobia was gendered by feminists in a particularly damaging kind of way. So speaking on behalf of more than, quote, 200 leading human rights and women's organizations in the US and around the world, the Washington-based Feminist Majority Foundation not only backed the Afghan war, but also called on the US administration to increase the level of American troops in Kabul at that time, and also to extend the war into the rest of the country. In Canada, of course, we had feminists do the same. A very good example of this is Sally Armstrong, who has worked for human rights, particularly in Afghanistan, for a long time. She called for a similar expansion of the reach of Canadian, American, and other NATO forces in her documentary, Daughters of Afghanistan. Many of you might have seen it. It was regularly broadcast on CBC. This feminist politics, with a global reach, was not unconnected to the domestic activism of these feminists. So the National Organization of Women, for example, was reported to have, quote, used the terrorist attacks to flag its own domestic agenda, declaring that in this time of national and global turmoil, the reasons we celebrate coming out day are more visible and important than ever, and the organization proceeded to call for a permanent lifting of the ban on gays in the military. So we see here how these feminists and their organizations, as the urgent expansion of the war, actually created more political space for their own engagement within national politics, for their own access to the state. And what we saw was a very disturbing alliance emerge between feminist organizations who were interested and who were committed to doing international human rights work, post-conflict Reconstruction, suddenly there was an opening to work with the state in ways that had not been possible before. And I feel that that was a very, very dangerous opening that feminists have embraced, with very little problematization. Feminists, and these particular feminists who made this argument for the expansion of the war on terror, went further to call for its extension into the entire Middle East. This position was articulated most strongly by Phyllis Chesler, a founding figure of second-wave feminism. In her book, The New Anti-Semitism was, as the title suggested, a fairly uncomplicated tract arguing that the US and Israel were targets of a deadly enemy, Islam and Muslims, and the terrorist politics they espouse. Both countries needed to band together to defeat this threat was the argument, and other feminists, of course, joined Chesler very quickly in this perspective, in this argument of the new anti-Semitism. And these feminists included Muslim feminists in the West as well. And, most of us are very familiar with Irshad Manji, Ayan Hirsi Ali, Azir Nafasi. We can think of other feminists since then who joined them. They have made a very, very strong argument for expansion of these wars into the Middle East, into North Africa, in the name of defeating hyper-misogynist Islam and in defeating hyper-patriarchal Muslim men. These feminists linked Islamists to Nazism, and using the language of the neoconservatives argued that the West had become a target of what they called Islamofascists, only because of its civilizational superiority, which they defined by way of its gender norms, gender practices, and the status of women in Western countries. These feminists continue to draw on the apocalyptic view of the clash of civilizations that was initially promoted by Samuel Huntington and Bernard Lewis, and which became central to the neoconservative and neoliberal foreign policy of successive US administrations. Today, we find this perspective to be a key pillar of Trumpism, as this political phenomenon is now being named. This feminist politics sits very well with calling for a ban on Muslims in the US, with calling for a militarization and a securitization of the borders. The contribution of these feminists was to give the imperialist politics of neoconservative and neoliberal forces, which had earlier been defined by most feminists as anti-woman, a feminist makeover by identifying gender as a central dimension of the clash of civilization versus barbarism. In Canada, we saw the enactment of the Barbaric Cultural Practices Act under the Harper government, which very few feminists actually opposed. We saw the Sharia debate in Ontario, rise to hysterical heights. This kind of feminism, as I said earlier, sits very comfortably with the logic of the imperialist state. It dehistoricizes and decontextualizes the conflict between the US-led alliance and its opponents in the Middle East, North Africa, Central Asia, other parts of the world. Situating this conflict instead in an eternal primitivism and a gendered primitivism of Islam, which they say is characterized by an ostensible hatred of Christian and Jewish peoples or of Western civilization for the secularist feminists, and characterized by Muslim men's hatred of women and non-normative gender and sexual minorities. These feminists present this primitivism as having marked human history for centuries. It's a war between the forces of good and evil. We hear that repeated endlessly by the ultra-nationalist movements. Unfortunately, it has very strong echoes in certain types of feminist politics. Politically, it engages in a fear-mongering that borders on the paranoid, what Ghassan Hedges called paranoid nationalism, in representations of Muslims, men and women. It also disappears Muslim queers and gender and sexual minorities, as Jasbir Puar and Jean Heratawan and others have noted so powerfully. It is a familiar colonial narrative that lent feminist credence to the racialized fantasy of an eternal war of the civilized West, defined as culturally Judeo-Christian in secular terms, against the forces of Islamic fanaticism. This sits very well, as I said, with many aspects of this rise of the ultranationalist ideology that we're living with at the moment. The second type of feminist response I have grouped under what I called imperial precariousness. Imperial precariousness. So this set of responses came from feminists who drew attention to how the 9/11 attacks and the war on terror revealed how conditions of vulnerability shape the lives of women everywhere. The concept of precarity, precarious lives, disposable lives is now pervasive in feminist analysis of international conflict, of the global war on terror. This concept can be traced to the work of Judith Butler, of course, who argued from this perspective in her book Precarious Lives, The Powers of Mourning and Violence. Opposed to the war on Iraq, Butler was very, very clear that she condemned state violence and that she was completely opposed to the war in Iraq. She also condemned anti-Semitism as the violence of the US state. She also argued that there was a very important need to separate anti-Semitism from anti-Zionism. So this was a very important perspective that Butler articulated in opposing the invasion of Iraq, the war in Iraq. Arguing for the need to address the root causes of 9/11 in this book, Butler undertook an examination of the basis for building community in the face of violence and mourning, the suspension of the law in the name of national security, and the necessity for ethical and moral responses to the new post-9/11 moment. Her main concern was, and I quote her, with the conditions of heightened vulnerability and aggression. She was also extremely critical of media reporting of the war, of the media's dehumanization of the Muslim other, arguing, well, not Muslim, Iraqi other, arguing that in not reporting on the violence done to them, the media made their lives, quote, unknowable and their deaths, quote, ungrievable. Butler's intervention, as I have said, was very significant politically, given her international position as a feminist intellectual, queer intellectual, and as a founding figure of post-structural postmodern feminism. As I argued at that time, Butler's analytic frame centered on the injury done to the US in the 9/11 attacks. The countless breachings of the boundaries of other countries by the US in the decades preceding were mentioned by her, but they did not shape her analytic frame. Although she acknowledged, quote, that others have suffered arbitrary violence at the hands of the US, end of quote, this suffering, for example, in Afghanistan and Iraq prior to the 9/11 attacks, amongst the many other well-documented cases of US aggression, was not her starting point. It did not shape her analytic frame. Instead, she positioned the injury done to the US, and even that in terms of the nation, not the actual victims who had died in the 9/11 attacks, but Americans speaking the language of the US nation. So this is at the center of her construct, which she outlines in Precarious Lives, a generalized suffering of a generalized humanity, and it is also the grounds for her philosophical and political deliberations on violence, grief, and mourning that was spurred by the War on Terror. This framing foregrounded, perhaps unintentionally, the imperial subject, who had suddenly and graphically discovered its own vulnerability, thus implicitly reproducing the claims of successive US administration of American innocence and exceptionalism. I argued at that time that the fact that this subject was disturbed by the violence, Butler was opposed to the invasion of Iraq, that this subject was disturbed by the war, did not glorify the war, did not deny the obvious violence being done to the others. In fact, she called for grieving the lives of these others, made it no less imperial. This subject was primarily disturbed by the war because of the violent response it was likely to generate in the future, and not because of this subject's unconditional opposition to the violence done in its name to its other, or opposition to the imperialist and settler colonial nature of the US nation state. Instead, Butler posited a vulnerability to violence that she defined as central to the human experience. Although she acknowledged such vulnerability was not equally distributed, her analysis nevertheless proceeded on the assumption that it was, as she reflected on the possibility of political community based on this shared American experience of loss, mourning, and vulnerability. In spite of having cautioned against the assumption of a universally shared human condition, her analysis advanced just such a notion of a universal, degendered, deracialized imperial subject. Butler thus grounded her narcissistic analysis of an imperialist war, its breaching of national boundaries and destruction of national sovereignties in the global south, of invasions and occupations, in the notion of a shared, primal, pre-individuated, psychic experience of human vulnerability. This theoretical move, I argue, elided the inequalities and the alterities historically constituted between those doing the occupying and invading and those being invaded and occupied. The commonality of the human experience posited by Butler, I argue, served to make the other the same as the self, erasing the experience of the other as the self moved back into the position of centrality, into the epistemically violent position of determining what constitutes the human experience. Her use of the self's experience of what she called a primal vulnerability to analyze the war ejected the analysis of power relations in the geopolitical order put on the global agenda by the 9/11 attacks and situated it instead in an abstract liberal individualist frame. With this move, the specific forms of vulnerability and violence that sustained colonial and imperialist relations became invisible, as vulnerability, defined from the condition of human infancy, was defined as primary and dominated the discursive frame and the framing of precarious lives. Consequently, Butler's imposition of the collective we in prioritizing this infant condition for both the Western, in this case American self, and its occupied other, if they were to be included in her conception of the human, denied recognition to the specific forms of vulnerabilities, injuries, and losses experienced by colonized, invaded, and occupied others, which are significantly different from those experienced by imperial subjects. The other's experience of loss and injury was thus equated with and subsumed within the experience of the imperial subject. In this manner, Butler could approach the invaded and occupied colonized object as being essentially the same as the imperial white self. Such a commonality of experience is, of course, practically impossible in the absence of the transformation of the conditions of global imperialism and the new forms of coloniality, as well as the old forms of settler colonialism with which we continue to live. What I found most problematic about Butler's work here is her reproduction of the universalist pretensions of Western philosophical, political, and psychoanalytic traditions, and implicitly of the Western self as the only truly human subject. Butler's analysis thus reinforced the denial of the historical scale and magnitude of the violence done to the other by the Western self, even as it furthered the discourse of a wounded and injured, but essentially innocent Western subject. It led to a failure to name Western states as imperialist powers. Perhaps Butler's criticism of the media for not covering the deaths resulting from the war was most revealing of her ethical preoccupations. Arguing that the media should give visibility to the war dead and hence make their deaths grievable, Butler explained that the mourning such witnessing would provoke would allow the war dead to be recognized as also having been worthy of life. In other words, viewing the dead would allow this community of the we to not only see their annihilated others, but through their dead visibility, the community witnessing the deaths would make those lost lives grievable, and hence grant them some humanity, but in the moment of their death and destruction. This call to make visible the dead is very interesting because the act of witnessing is presented as the key to a radical humanizing of the Western self, in that the witnessing would enable the self to feel grief and through a subsequent mourning find a common bond with the humanity of its other. What might the other have to say about this act of being seen in the moment of its destruction, about a grief and mourning that is instantiated in the observer only in the moment of observing the other's death? So utterly dominant is the Western white perspective in Butler's frame that such questions do not even give her pause for concern in this particular book. The third set of responses that I have tracked from feminists use the concept, use the concept of a shared experience of vulnerability between Western women and Muslim women to recreate the Western woman as victim. And central to this was the notion of gender apartheid in the Muslim world, which became very, very popular among a particular group of feminists who I would generally put in the kind of materialist theory framework. Such a feminist alliance, I find, that between Western woman as victim subject and Muslim woman as likewise victim subject, I argue, erases the location of Western women as privileged subjects, albeit gendered, in relation to Muslim women and to Muslim men. This sort of response I found to be best exemplified in Zilla Eisenstein's book Against Empire. Zilla Eisenstein, of course, defines herself as a socialist feminist. Like Butler, Eisenstein stated her opposition not just to the war on terror, but to the US empire, which she noted had a long history of violence and exploitation, from the conquest of native peoples to the slave trade and into the present imperialist aggressions of the United States, the state itself. Drawing on her socialist feminist framework, Eisenstein's analysis argued that there was a class war in the US and abroad, and that neoliberalism and neoconservatism were an assault on the gains of the civil rights movement and the women's movement. The US government, she argued, was cutting taxes for the rich, supporting corporate corruption, and undertaking a dangerous remilitarization. Importantly, she rejected the East-West binary that informed the ideology of the global war, the clash of civilizations thesis. And with her linking of the war to contemporary US imperialism and to its history of colonization of the Americas, Eisenstein's analysis promised a more fruitful approach. However, after outlining this history, her theoretical lens became fixated on gender in the international context, elevating gender to primacy. Eisenstein challenged the dominant framing of the war on terror as an intervention to save Afghan women. But she did this by restating the argument popular among many Western feminists who opposed the war, that the Bush administration had, quote unquote, hijacked feminism, drawing attention to male domination and violence against women in the United States. She argued that the causes of the war were, quote, a masculinist military mentality that dominated in the East and the West. So there's this kind of backhanded reintroduction of this East-West dichotomy that is rejected in her opening in her book, but then she makes the argument that this masculinist military mentality dominates both in the East and the West. So it kind of creeps back into the analysis. She then went on to argue that this mentality took the form of gender apartheid in Afghanistan and sexual terrorism in the US, conflating both as being the same. Here, the status and power of American men and the US military was equated with that of Afghan men, the Taliban, the Afghan state, the patriarchy of both being treated as essentially of the same order with the same consequences for women. She also presented the control of women's sexuality as a major motivation of Al-Qaeda and the 9/11 attacks. By attributing this sexual motive to the 9/11 attacks, and by relegating colonialism, race, and racism mainly to the past, this perspective furthered the view that Islamists are motivated by, quote, a hatred of women's sexuality, and with little attempt to actually engage with Al-Qaeda's political demands or with the West's racialization of Muslim men as hyper-misogynist and homophobic, or with any actual engagement with the many writings and statements of Islamists, or even, I would say, Muslim feminists. This feminist insistence that male domination and sexual violence in the US be addressed was certainly a welcome departure, particularly in a political moment when the demonization of Islam and Muslims relied on rendering invisible secular forms of patriarchal practices and secular forms of gendered violence. Unfortunately, however, this insistence was not enough to undermine the dominant racialized and gendered construct of the third world men, including most immediately Muslim men, as fanatic and hyper-violent. Moreover, in presenting a global misogyny as the cause of the current conflict, this position represents an experience of gender oppression as shared equally by Western and Muslim women. The patriarchy that both are said to be subject to is defined as being essentially of a kind, perhaps the Muslim version being more violent. The rejection of the East-West binary thus replaces it with a gender binary. Certainly, one cannot argue with the feminist contention that sexual economics underpin the global economy, nor can one deny the realities of the violence that exist in both the, quote, East and the West. However, in the absence of an equally rigorous emphasis on the social relations of race and coloniality, in the absence of an equally substantive critique of white supremacy, this perspective dovetails with the very imperial framework it attempts to reject, and there is an attempt to reject it. In claiming a shared experience of gender oppression between American women and Muslim women in Afghanistan without examining the racialized experiences, the colonial relations that bind Muslim men and women in Afghanistan with those in the US, these feminists treat Western women's oppression as essentially the same as that of Muslim women, which I argue conceals the unequal power relations between Western women and Muslim women and men. So in conclusion, I kind of keep thinking I really have to move on from these texts because I am really quite fed up of rereading them. But what happens is any new feminist perspective that is put out, unfortunately, fits right into one of these trends that I have identified. So I have to keep going back to engaging that because, these are now becoming the authoritative feminist perspectives They are giving us the authoritative feminist concepts that are now shaping the field of research, political activism, and political mobilizing. So in conclusion, I'll come back to my opening question. Women have to be more active, and I'm using women here with the kind of square quotes around them because it is a category that is fraught with all kinds of perils. Have to become active in all dimensions of national and global politics, but the question that has to be central is to what end? How far have we moved to destabilize the idea of gender as being primary? Those of us who were reading feminist texts and engaged in feminist debates in the 1990s know how divisive these debates were. How far have we really moved from this destabilization of gender as primary and away from the construct of a universal woman based on the particular experience and interests of Western women? Anti-racist and anti-colonial feminist politics, anti-imperialist feminist politics, womanist politics, and now increasingly we can add Muslim women and Islamist feminist politics are needed even more urgently now than ever. We need to engage in these debates no matter how divisive and how painful they are, because that is the only way in which any form of feminist politics that can be defended will actually proceed. Otherwise, I don't know what. But all of my work, research, activism leads me to this point. We cannot avoid these debates, these dialogues, without reinscribing a colonial and imperialist version of feminism. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that really engaging talk. You touched a lot of hard points that we talk about in our pedagogy we struggle with to make these connections with our students. So thank you for that. Do you have some time for questions for Dr. Thobani?
I come from a background of labor studies and industrial relations, and your remarks really struck me with some of the same arguments that are directed at the trade union movement in its, getting in bed with management, the post, class compromise, post-war compromise, and I just, getting so bureaucratic and so removed from your own roots that you don't know how to mobilize anymore. Those arguments are so similar. And I just wonder about the inevitability of the striving for power and influence in then, yourself being dominant and just falling into all the same traps that the dominant prior to you was. And just your reflections on how does a movement do that differently? Is it inevitable that the sort of any kind of progressive movement is going to fall into the trap of, well, when you've got power, you start kind of looking like the power that came before you?
Well, I would never leave my bedroom if I thought that is the only option we have. I can't say anything other than we have to have a politics that is self-reflexive, that is willing to engage with the tremendous changes that are taking place, that is willing to accept that we make mistakes, that is willing to engage in dialogue, and that is willing to recognize that there are some foundational fault lines in the making of the nation state, in the making of the global order, And we can name them colonialism and imperialism. And that these are issues, yes, they intersect with gender, yes, they intersect with class, all of the kinds of connections that intersectionality has taught us to make. But in this particular moment, we're living through a global crisis where coloniality is being reintroduced into global forms of governance. We're seeing the destruction of liberal democratic institutions. We are seeing the stripping away of the rights of citizenship of Muslims everywhere in the world. We are seeing an institutionalization of violence as the only modality of governance of Muslims. And these are driving us into a crisis situation that has to be at the center of our political analysis. So I can't say, yes, this is a moment of late capitalism. Yes, we're seeing all kinds of transformation being made to the class structure. We're living through, these are deeply connected. But as long as we continue to frame them within the context of the nation-state system, and as long as we continue to confine our politics within this framework, I see a very difficult time ahead for us. Yeah.
One more question.
Have you seen sort of an evolution from when you started working on this in these 15 years? I know you say that you keep coming back to it, but your work, the work of Sharina Razak since then, Natasha Bakht, others, I feel like there is an emerging maybe fourth area of scholarship that has this perspective. If you wanted to speak to that.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's very, very marginal. And this perspective is present in other quote-unquote nation states as well. We are seeing it being articulated, but we continue to see a reluctance of mainstream feminist, what I call authoritative feminism, actually engage with those politics. And when I think back to the 1990s, which was, in a sense, a moment of real possibility for transformation, right? Not only in Canada, in the US, in the UK, other places as well, we were seeing the rise of black feminism. It's being, displacing mainstream feminist perspectives. We were seeing anti-racist feminism. We were seeing indigenous feminism having a real impact on not only mainstream feminist politics, but on mainstream political life, right? We were seeing that have an impact. And with 9/11, that has disappeared. In fact, I think that for the kinds of politics that I'm advocating, there was more space in the 1990s than there is today. So I've actually seen a closing down of that space. And for me, it is not very surprising because of the racial politics of the global war on terror, right? Yeah? This resurgence of Western civilizational supremacy, right? That was a response to what the civil rights movement had won, what multicultural politics, as tepid as they are, had managed to kind of, displace in terms of Canada as a white man's country, if I can put it like that, in terms of the anti-racist and anti-imperialist politics that had emerged since the 1950s and 1960s, that what we saw is that the post-9/11 moment has been an assault on all of those politics, right? And we've actually moved backwards. I mean, Trump wants to take us back into the 18th century, but the political kind of being pushed back was a moment that I think occurred in the immediate 9/11 moment, and we continue to live with those effects. We continue to see the same kinds of analysis being forwarded that were actually produced at that time. Yeah. So.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
There's so many questions.
Thank you.